Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Branko Milanovic. Branko is senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality at the City University of New York. And he's also visiting professor at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. Branko is also the author of Visions of Inequality from the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War. This is a book that was recently published by University Press, and I'm very happy of having Branko here. Branko, how are you?
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
No, thanks for being here. I'm very, very excited about our conversation. We're going to be talking about the book and your view on inequality. But before that, I would like to start by asking you about your life and your career. And I'm curious about how you ended up being interested in inequality. Now it seems such a trendy topic that naturally seems something that people would be interested in working on. But what was the origin of that interest, in particular in the context of what you describe as the eclipse of inequality?
Yes, well, it's a good question, actually. As you said, today, it's a kind of a no-brainer because many people are interested in inequality. And of course, there are lots of data, and it is considered, sufficiently intellectually challenging topic that people would sort of work on it. But it was very different in practically all aspects. First of all, I got interested in the topic when I was studying at university in what is today Serbia and in the past was Yugoslavia. Because I was studying economics, but economics and statistics. So we had lots of statistics. And as you know, statistics are actually, a lot of it is about the distributions. But I really couldn't see exactly where to apply these distributions. And on the other hand, I was interested in social issues because I was very much influenced by Marxist literature, which of course puts the social issues at the forefront. And what very few people nowadays know, because very few people read Marx, and I'm sure we'll speak about that later, Marx is very empirical. There are lots of data. So anyway, when I first time saw that actually you had an application for somebody who was socially interested of distribution functions, and that application was really for the distribution of income and wealth, I really became very much interested. And then basically I started studying, Lorentz curves, the Gini coefficient, the Taylor coefficient, and so on. So the interest came from the combination of the two. Interest in statistics combined with interest in sort of explaining social issues or sort of analytically looking at them.
Can I ask you more about your training as an economist and, the area of influence of socialism or communism and your transition to a career in the U.S. with such a different framework and from every possible angle? How was that process? I don't know if you mind talking about your arrival here in the U.S. and how did that work?
It's a long question, but I would not say that it was very different because, for example, my undergraduate studies were a combination of, indeed, we studied Marx, but we studied also what is considered neoclassical economics. The two things actually, were studied simultaneously. And I don't think it's a wrong approach. I actually think it's very sad that people do not have that approach, because what the classical approach gives you is economics, actually the political economy, and we'll talk about that in the book, as explaining long-term economic process. When you study neoclassical supply and demand, it's explaining to you why the apples cost $1.50, but it doesn't tell you why feudalism was replaced by capitalism, nor different stages in capitalism. You just don't have that. You have actually, I would even say, fairly simplistic views. I read today all these debates, hundreds of debates, inflation rate 2%, 3%, 4%. Okay, fine. It really doesn't matter in a greater scheme of things. What matters is actually whether U.S. would maintain its advantage, whether artificial intelligence would actually make labor in some areas redundant, how it would play socially or politically. These are the issues. But, unfortunately, we have, and now I'm not already to the divisions of inequality, unfortunately, we have lived and continue to live through an eclipse still of economics, in the sense that these broad factors where economics explains the rise and fall of nations and the rise and fall of different types of civilizations is not studied, or it's actually studied less, let's say, than the first one when you explain the price of apples in the 60th Street in New York.
Let's use that then to start talking about the book, right? And what you do is that, and this is a super interesting book in many dimensions, and one of those is that it's a history of economic thought book, but has a very intense empirical description, and it's also very rich from an economic history perspective, but still the structure is quite focused on a set of thinkers, right? There are 7. You start with Keynes, then you follow with Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Pareto, and then Kuznets, right? And I guess I'm sure that everyone asks you this, but why are those the ones that you were focusing on and not others? Are there any omissions that you think are relevant? And I have to tell you, like the first, I have a few in mind. I thought, well, why are we not talking about Malthus and his obsession with and concern with the poor, right? And I thought also about John Stuart Mill, that for political theories, it's always the person they think about when they think about distributional matters.
Yeah. Well, okay, very good question. Let me just put it like that. First of all, the choice, there are like for many choices in life, there is one subjective and there is one objective part. The subjective part is that the 6 people who you mentioned were really the authors that I've been reading for many years, and actually have written articles. For example, not many people write articles about Keynes, and I did actually, because Keynes, his tableau économique, has a sort of a summarized or embellished income distribution of France by around 1760. So that attracted me to Keynes. And of course, the others that you mentioned, like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, were people who have really read Marx, as I mentioned before, since I was 17 or 18. Smith later, maybe first time when I read Smith 23, probably Ricardo, probably around the same time, if not earlier. And then obviously Pareto and Kuznets were crucial for my work on income inequality, because we used methodology that was developed by Pareto, and of course we used the inverted U curve that was of course developed by Kuznets. So that was kind of a combination. These are the people whom I really knew well. So when I wrote the book, I read numerous things from them, but there was nothing really new. Nothing per se that I was like learning about individuals. I learned more about their lives, but not really so much about what they wrote. Then we go to your really good question. First, Malthus. I really have not read Malthus, and I have to say that because I was influenced by Marx, I have developed really strong aversion to Malthus. You just have to develop this aversion, because even on a purely individual level. Then I read his correspondence with Ricardo, and that aversion really increased, because while Ricardo is polite, nice, pleasant, friendly, even in disagreements, he remains friendly. Malthus is not. Malthus is unpleasant, ready for fights, for quarrels. And on the other hand, he's a minister, and you think like, these people hate people, and he is a minister of religion. So anyway, I have to say, Malthus, on a pure personal level, I just don't like it. John Stuart Mill is a different issue, and actually he's mentioned again because Marx wrote about him, and he has obviously that very famous division between the laws of production, which are sort of natural, technological, and laws of distribution, which are socially oriented, so produced by society. So maybe he could have been included. And a person who I also wanted to include, but eventually I realized that there was not enough, in my opinion, to give him an entire chapter, was somewhat strangely Samir Amin. And the reason he's mentioned towards the end of the book, because actually the neo-Marxist thinkers introduced an entirely new dimension, which was to look at internal distribution within a country in the context or is being determined by the global relations of power. And in Samir Amin's case, it's very clear, for example, in dissertation, he talks about the Egyptian, the distribution of income in Egypt as being really influenced and determined by external factors. So he was the one that actually I thought of making him number 7, but as I said, I did not, because I just didn't think that there was enough for him to have entire chapter. At least that was, according to my reading, obviously somebody might have different views. And maybe structuralists were, that's another possibility I was thinking. But as I mentioned in the introduction, like knowledge of the Latin American structuralism was not sufficient.
Let me use this mention to the international view of Amin to ask you something about Kenne, because one of the things that the physiocrats in general, but Kenne in particular, seems to be quite different from the broader intellectual move of the period, I guess, the mercantilist ideas. It's actually its internal, like, oriented approach, right? And in a certain way, what I was thinking was that that's probably at the core of the way in which we think about inequality today, inequality within a country. Maybe mercantilists were thinking probably about inequality, but across countries, and the zero-sum like logic that they had was probably quite reflective of that. But Kenne seemed to be, right, maybe the first person thinking so within the society and about, the conflicts that emerge across classes and so on. So I want to ask you about that, about the origins of that set of ideas of thinking society as a given thing and wondering about what's happening internally and what are probably the origins of that. The expansion of the notion of the nation state was important. What was the thing in the French context that maybe was important for Kenne to have that approach? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually think Kenne is very important. And I think Kenne, as you said, actually, first is important because there was a marked break from American. Even if you were to try to impose some kind of interest or order about income distribution on mercantilists, you would probably end up, as we're saying, by seeing mercantilists as essentially discussing international inequality and interests of power. And of course, their interest was maximization of having positive balance of trade and maximization of inflow of specie into a country. So there was not really an interest for internal distribution, essentially because it was believed that most of the people would live with something like the subsistence. What they were interested in was how much power the king would have vis-a-vis other kings. Okay, so what is the difference with physiocrats? Big difference. First, actually, the welfare of what this says, speaks of is zones. The welfare of the majority of the people becomes really the objective of economic policy. That's the first. Secondly, the class structure is defined. The class structure looks more or less like the French structure before the revolution with legally defined classes. And a top class, which he calls propriétaire, is defined, and that top class receives a surplus, which is also a totally new idea that there is the economic activity produces the surplus. So at least there are three important novelties that we actually take almost as given, and that is actually the class structure of society, the idea of the surplus, and the welfare of the most of society is an objective of economic policy. And then when it comes to policies, obviously what was, important for them was, as it was succinctly put in laissez-faire, laissez-passer, laissez-faire, is the abolishment of all the internal barriers to trade and the reduction of the government influence for the guild system, regulations, and rest on entrepreneurs. So, they have a very strong also modern component, which you can really relate to today's developments. So I think they were very important in development of economic thought, and I'm actually quite happy to put Kenne as the first thinker, and then of course Adam Smith as the second. And I just want to mention that the two of them are the only two people in the book of the six that we spoke about who actually met physically. The others did not meet each other.
Let's get into Smith then, and following this theme on liberalism, most people describe Smith as a pro-capitalist figure, right? And one of the things that you do in the book is trying to argue against that, and I thought it was quite interesting. So I want you to tell me what exactly do you mean by the fact that Smith was not pro-capitalist or even against capital in a certain way, or capitalist better maybe, and why do you think that the public opinion and even the intelligentsia, if we want to call them, do not see Smith usually from that perspective? What are we reading wrong of Smith?
Well, I would also put later your question, so you reminded me actually relationship between Smith and Ricardo, because I think they are differently read today compared to what they really were. But let's go with Smith. Indeed, Smith was, for things that I already mentioned in relationship to physiocrats, he was for freedom of trade. He was also for reduction of the importance of power of government. And that's actually the key issue that is totally disregarded today in what I believe is extraordinary selective reading of Smith. He was against the influence of capitalist interest on government policy. I can sort of say word by word 10 times, but he was very skeptical of any organization. And that skepticism about organizations goes against even organized religion. He has a number of comments in The Wealth of Nations, very critical of organized religion. He sees it essentially as popular prejudice, which is not the case in the theory of moral sense. So, organized religion, organized labor in passing, but not very much, because he believed that workers are uneducated and have little influence on government policy, and consequently are unlikely to influence government policy. And his sort of a very strong statement against capitalists being able to influence government policy, because he believed that actually it's so like East India as an extreme example of that. They were only interested in obviously maximizing their income. They are actually quite indifferent to the fate of the country where they are, and they are very sophisticated, and they are thereby they have quite a lot of influence on government policy. And finally, which I think is a very important point that actually I really would urge people to read, is that he believes that the only source of income which goes down with the development of capitalism is profit, because rents go up since the demand for land increases. Wages go up because every advanced society is characterized by increase in the welfare of the majority of people, which was workers. And only profit goes down because there is simply more stock, as he calls it, more capital, and that capital competes against each other, and profit rate goes down. The same story like in Marx, basically, or Ricardo. And then they do not have an interest for societal improvement because they know that it would drive their source of income down. And what is interesting is Smith, he actually derives the danger of capitalists giving advice to or actually determining government policy from the distributional side, from the fact that their source of income is going to go down. And I think these elements, the two elements in particular, to repeat, the Smith very negative attitude towards capitalists as influencer of policies, and the derivation of that from distributional concerns are totally disregarded and not really mentioned. Even the second was certainly not mentioned in literature and the discussion on honesty.
Why do you think that that's the case? Is it like fully like specific interests that have been able to hit in this, or is just I don't know, I guess the focus on the most visible and sexiest part of, like, I don't know, the invisible hand is something that probably gives the sense that it's just that capitalists are just the essential part of the story of how society works. I don't know what's your hypothesis?
I think that, of course, he takes highly of entrepreneur and capitalist under the conditions of free competition. But he says, and I intentionally use this term, he talks about real existing capitalists. But he doesn't use these words. I'm using them from today's perspective. He doesn't even use the word capitalism. He uses commercial society. But when he discusses the commercial society as it is, he is extraordinarily negative about the way that the wealth is acquired. And basically, that's why I put it on one page, one statement after another from Smith. He talks about plunder, monopoly, slavery, all the types of all the ways that people have become rich in a commercial society, and practically all of them involve either a swing or the use of political or economic power to make money and so on. So these quotes are many. They're all over the place in the wealth of nations. But why didn't it become interpreted like that? I think it's because of the selective reading, because of political influence, and because if you take only the quotes where he criticizes the government and the interference of government in the natural sort of development of societies, which actually the famous quote were actually very little but tolerable application of justice or less interference with the state is sufficient for societies to develop. If you just take that criticism and totally disregard the other one, then of course he becomes a critic of government interference and government influence, and he becomes ipso facto a supporter of capitalists. But he was not, as I was saying. So it takes a more, I think, close reading, or actually it takes any reading, because I think many of these quotes are what people know, and they have never read them in the context.
Right, that's super interesting. And after Smith, you delve into Ricardo, right? And you describe Ricardo as someone profoundly concerned with class conflict, right? And what I'm curious there is about the role of the Industrial Revolution in this view, right? Because, well, by the time that Ricardo was working on his ideas, well, the UK was being transformed already in a significant way by what we call now the Industrial Revolution. How important was that in on his views on inequality?
You know, Ricardo was each of the writers that I'm talking about are very interesting, but he is super interesting as well for many reasons. He takes a totally local issue, which was the corn laws in Great Britain, and he transforms this local issue into something which really became the foundational stone of economics. And he does that because of the extremely abstract analysis that he does with core laws. So you don't need to worry anymore about Great Britain or anything. It's so abstract that actually that you derive, the sort of economic thinking is derived to a large extent from the principle. It's actually basically a model of economy that he presents there. But if I were to actually take that, was I think an interesting point. If I were to, let's suppose that I am a big fan of capitalists and Davos. By the way, Sinek actually explicitly says that the government should never support masters, meaning employers, gatherings, because they always gather in order to work against public interest and to actually organize themselves and monopolize the power, economic power. And what we see today is very opposite. The governments actually grow and are very happy that capitalists meet in Davos, that governments participate. So it's really, if I were to, going back to what I was started to say, if I were to choose a thinker as a capitalist whom I would actually support, who supports me, is Ricardo. Ricardo the whole book is written because of the fear that more and more of net produce or net income would belong to the landlord, and consequently capitalists would be squeezed. And if they're squeezed, they don't have wherewithal for investment. And if there is no investment, there is no growth. So Ricardo sees capitalists as an orderly active agent which drives capitalists to grow. And when he says in the introduction of Principles, this famous quote, that the problem of the distribution is the central problem of political economy, it precisely means that if the end result of the core law is that most of the income is in the hands of landlords and very little income is in the hands of capitalists, there will be no growth. End of story. So if I were to choose who is the pro-capitalist thinker, it's Ricardo. It's not Split. But Ricardo, interestingly, for many reasons, including labor theory of value, developed, and because of the sharpness of the conflict, had a whole slew of Ricardo socialists, as you know, and of course of Marx, and then neo-Ricardians. So he actually has lots of left-wing thinkers, where it's really his thinking, original thinking, is entirely pro-capitalist. And this is weird, and Smith was thinking, actually, as I was saying before, is very critical of employers, becomes emblematic writer for the capitalist class. So something really doesn't match between these two authors and our perception of them.
That's a very interesting paradox. It's true, right? The legacy of these thinkers has been disconnected pretty much from some of its core ideas, and probably that pushes in the right direction to talk about Marx, right? Which is the one that follows after Ricardo. And it was for me very interesting. It's been a while since I read something about Marx, but I studied in Colombia, still somewhat influenced from the ideas of Marxist theories. And my dad was also was a Marxist in his youth, so I started reading quite a bunch of the things that he read when he was young. And what I remember feeling back then was that in these books about the history of economic thought from a Marxist perspective, the story was a bit like, there were these sort of rigorous classical thinkers and there were relevant ideas to discuss there. Then there were the utopian socialists, and then came Marx, that was a real scientific socialist, right? And then recently, in the last few years, there's some people that have argued that Marx maybe was just one of other socialist thinkers, right? And there's this paper that was quite discussed recently, sort of arguing that. And then I want to ask you about it, right? So Well, first, what were Marx's ideas on distribution as you describe them in the book? And how accurate is this description that Marx was profoundly different from other socialists of that generation?
First, do you have the paper? I cannot remember the author. It's the one from the Journal of Political Economy.
Yep, that's the one I had in mind.
I actually was in sort of discussion. I even wrote for the Marx bicentenary of his birth a long article about why Marx became so famous. And of course, obviously the revolution, Russian Revolution played a huge role, Lenin played a huge role. But that's not the critique, If without the depression, there will not be chaos, So the article is actually, I have to say, in its original idea, is how should I say, either trivial or obvious, If there was no commercial revolution, there would be no Smith. If Scotland had not actually developed as much during Smith's lifetime, so that he himself, as he says, could observe the advantages of commercial society and the advantages of government with England too. There will be no wealth of nation. So when you're saying, well, there was an external event like the Russian Revolution, and then Marx became, of course, the leader read everywhere. It's not an argument against. It's actually that's how thinkers become thinkers. If there was no Florentine Wars, there would be no Machiavelli. So, it's a bizarre idea that was in this paper. But leaving that paper, going to what's the only, he was the one that among many, of course, but he is the depth of his thinking. And the areas that he covered puts him really ahead of many others. And the fact that he was not a utopian socialist thinker makes him, of course, much more attractive, because he is not, as he believed, he's not describing, and he spent very little time describing socialist society, but he is studying, and he believed he developed discovered the laws of motion of society. So he is only a describer of what he believes how societies would evolve, and why proletarian class would eventually be the last class that would rule, because obviously, as you know, they don't have an interest of their own in mind, but they have societal interest in mind. So he had that breadth and that vision, combined with philosophical and economic, that others did not. And I don't see that as a sort of accidental event that actually he became sort of singled out, and the entire Marxist school developed. Now, that school was already present before 1917, as you know, in the Social Democratic Party, but there was a split with Bernstein most famously, that essentially saw Marxism as a very useful for ideological reasons, but not for, as Bernstein said, not for the goal. Their goal was no longer replacement of capitalism by socialism, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, but the objective was improvement in capitalism. So he was obviously even then a very important thinker, but he was made more important by the Russian Revolution, and then by the association between the socialist school of thought and decolonization. So that was something obviously that came with the events, and probably without the Russian Revolution that would not have.
Right. Let's get now into Pareto. And there you describe a sharp, well, I don't know if sharp, but like a clear disruption between the way in which inequality was being understood and even measured before and after, right? And on the one hand, you have this move away from social classes and this focus on probably the individual, and also a sharper distinction between maybe two groups, and or rather focus on the elites. And I don't know how much this actually represents the idea of social classes, at least not from the same perspective that the authors before, right? And then my question there is, what were the forces behind this change of view on inequality? And then a similar question to the one I raised when talking about Smith. Why, when, at least in economics, when we think about Pareto, we usually think about his contributions and I guess the conventional neoclassical theory, right? Sociologists talk a lot about his ideas on elites and, more generally speaking, about distribution. But why do you think that economists have ignored, broadly speaking, those ideas?
The economists have ignored the idea of the elite in Pareto. As you said, actually, it was much more sociologists who, were influenced by Pareto, Loska, Sorel, and so on. But the economists were not. But they were influenced by Pareto's view about income distribution because of the power law, the Pareto constant. So he is present. But ideologically, Pareto is, of course, also extremely interesting person because he originally develops his own thinking. He was a classic liberal at the very beginning, and then, of course, towards the end of his life, he was very critical of liberalism. As you know, there were also some allegations which I don't think are very strong, but of his sort of, how should I say, flirtation with fascism. He died in 23, so, he became, Mussolini appointed him to be a senator, but it was really a honorific function. Anyway, so original thinking was developed also in reaction to Marx in a very special way. He believed, and that comes from his sociological views, he believed that essentially socialism will win, in the same way that later Schumpeter believed the same. But he believed socialism would win because not because of the laws of martial societies that Marx discovered, but because of the commitment, belief, self-abnegation of the forces that promoted socialism. In other words, he saw them like the first Christians. They were willing to sacrifice themselves, eventually they would win. But then, he was an engineer studying income, starting getting the numbers from the Pareto coefficient would come later. He actually then argued, yes, you can win, but in terms of income distribution, you would not change much. And I have empirical evidence that all this data that I have collected show more or less the same distribution at the top, but the social class would change. So in other words, he found things which are so supportive of his own thinking. He believed in the circulation of the elites. He believed that there would be an elite composed of lions, that was the elite of socialists, versus the elite of foxes, that was the capitalist elite, which doesn't use force so much, but uses cunning and propaganda to maintain power. And then he said the new elite would come, and that it would not change income distribution. And he was actually in many ways right that socialism, when it came, Marxist socialism, just had a new elite. And that elite was based on other criteria, not private ownership of the means of production, but the position in a hierarchy. So he was in that sense, right. But he was, of course, not right, as we know now, in belief that income distribution is immutable or that there is some kind of higher law and so on. But it really, as I was saying before, it really fitted his views of the circulation of the elite with unchanged income distribution very well. So I think he was very happy to have discovered that income distributions do not vary very much at the top.
Now, finally, the last of the authors that you explore in the book is Simon Kuznets, right? And he has this sort of optimistic view of inequality, in the sense that he thinks that eventually with economic growth, and he has a strong emphasis studying economic growth, so it's an interesting also element that integrates and complements his views on inequality. He argues that eventually that is going to lead to reductions in inequality. And what I'm curious there is about the role of his exposure to what was happening in the U.S., right? So he was writing in the middle of the 20th century, experiencing the sustained growth of the U.S. How important was this for his ideas? What type of data was he seeing? Was he actually being able to see a reduction in inequality? How were these elements important in his view of inequality in the long term?
The first, let me say, since you mentioned, but all the authors in the book are actually strong supporters of economic growth. I already mentioned that for Kenneth, obviously it was Smith also because of the importance of the prosperity, or actually opulence, in the sense of the middle classes, or at least the working class. The middle class does not appear as in the name. Ricardo obviously was for growth. Marx was for growth. Pareto, I think indirectly, I'm not quite sure that actually very directly. And of course, that's likewise. And it's important to situate each of the authors as the book does, because the book, the structure, as you know, the chapters is actually to say something about rule from lives of the authors. So it's not Wikipedia page, it's something really that is very interesting. And then to situate them and within the income distribution of the countries that they studied and worked on. So obviously for Marx, it is actually the British income distribution of the latter part of the second part of the 19th century, and German as well, for Kenneth, French, and so forth. But for Kuznets, it's important to situate him as well in the context. And what was the context of Kuznets? And that's absolutely a big key. First, he's working in the United States during the starts from before the World War II, but during World War II and afterwards. And he sort of derides his, in terms of income distribution, his famous inverted U-shaped curve in 1955-56. Now, that was the time where the U.S. had a total supremacy economically in the world by producing 3% of the world population, is producing 40% of the global output. So that's the first. So there is an optimistic view which comes from that. Secondly, the growth rate was recovered during the war in the U.S. was very high, and then there was a small depression in 47, but then it continued quite well, and growth was very good. Third, the U.S. experienced significant decrease in income inequality. So much as a quote in the book, our reference saying, writing, in like, I think 15 or 20 years, we have traveled 1/3 of the road to complete equality. So there are three elements: political, economic dominance and political of the United States. Secondly, high growth rate. And third, reduction of inequality. So obviously, Kuznets' view tended to be more optimistic because of what he has experienced here, where in the United States when he was born. And then that was translated also to the sort of more general level, in the same way that Ricardo took a particular problem of England and created it into a general issue. And likewise, Kuznets did it with the inverted U-shaped curve. And the data that he had were very relatively few. I actually mentioned it. I don't remember what it was, like 6 countries or 6 data points. He had obviously the US, he had a little bit of Germany, because there was some German data from before World War I. There was, I think, about the new countries, Ceylon, which is today Sri Lanka. I think it was Costa Rica. There were like really very few data points. As he said, he said for himself, my own idea is 95% speculation and 5% data. But he shared this data, and then later, of course, we got many more data. And as you know, the whole small industry developed by discussing whether the Kuznets curve exists or doesn't exist. And even I, in my book, The Global Inequality, then went using that and arguing that actually what business observed was the first wave where actually inequality expanded, and then they were forced to draw it down. And then each technological revolution is, in some sense, the wave of a rising inequality, which then gets offset through dissipation of rents, political decision-making, or the reduction of the rate of profit. So, I think you can well, not easily, but you can certainly view Kuznets's original statement to be just one of the waves that would later come. And I think we can argue that actually today's wave started in the 1980s or mid-80s or early 90s. So, again, one should put him in the context. And I think one should also feel free, as I did with Kuznets waves, to actually go beyond Kuznets while using Kuznets. The same thing that, of course, happened with Ricardo or Marx or even Smith.
Let me ask you, I guess, final question that address how you finish the book and how you see the future of the research on inequality. And what you describe is that after Kuznets, what we have is an eclipse, and that's a very nice term, I guess, because eclipse don't last forever, and I guess we're seeing the exposed of it. And what I'm interested in knowing your thoughts on are about how long can this period after the eclipse last, right? And how important can be individual figures in this process, right? We're going to be writing this book 20 years from now, do you think that you would need one more chapter for this post-eclipse period? Are you concerned about some risk on this agenda in the future? How do you think about the field in the present and the coming years, decades?
Well, I see it very optimistically because, as you said, the eclipse don't last forever. And secondly, there are again developments that in the real world, the real economy, that have brought the eclipse to an end. And then obviously, I think the person who was intellectually the most, who contributed the most to the end of the eclipse is Piketty. I think there is no doubt about that. But again, like in his case, like in every case that we have mentioned, it was the underlying economic and political development that brought a certain point of view when it was expressed, and when people saw that it correlates well with the development to the fall. If Piketty had published, and I know his work because I've known him for a long time also, and his book, for example, which is very similar to Capital in the 21st Century, which dealt with France, was published, I think, 10 years earlier. If he had published also Capital in the 21st Century in 2005, nobody would pay any attention. The fact that it was published after the global financial crisis, after the top 1% growth was revealed, and on the other hand, the middle class growth, which was covered up through the ability to borrow, was exposed by the crisis. That predisposed a search, and we had actually beginning of a search for answers. And of course, when Piketty's book came along, it provided a very powerful answer to the question that we were already asked. So I'm optimistic for the future because I think, first, we have many more data now. Secondly, people find it, as I said in the very beginning, much more challenging. So they are actually very eager to work on it. While in the past, they were seeing that as a sort of a backwater, that only if you're like some crazy socialist, you want to study that. But if you really are a top guy, you would do financial economics and, go to Wall Street or actually be an economist who was hired by Wall Street. Now it's different, and I think it will last. And we have now three developments, and maybe I'll finish with that, which I find very comfortable and very, how should I say, developments which enable me to think very optimistically about the future. The first one is the return of capital back to the sea. During the eclipse, we studied a lot, wage differentials, skill versus unskilled, all of that. But capital, which is crucial, which actually represents not only, 20% of the GDP, but also represents a large part of income of the top, was really excluded. Only Atkinson, towards the end of his life, realized that, and he wanted actually to bring the capital back. So that's the return of capital as an object of study and its influence on income distribution, which now, of course, would be reinforced by the artificial intelligence. The second development is the creation of historical social tables, which means these are the only source of information that we now can create from the past societies, where we create classes, and depending on society, obviously classes will be differently defined, and their mean incomes and size. And that enables us to actually study inequality among the Aztecs, Byzantine Empire, Roman Empire, Iraq, Mesopotamia in the 10th century. And then I think eventually we will be able to formulate hypotheses about the behavioral forces that are leading to inequality in not only present societies, but in the past. And the third is the global inequality, because global inequality was obviously globalization, but also opens up a number of new issues that we didn't look at that from that angle before. It opens up the issues of migration, which is related to inequality between the countries, opens up the issue of the global middle class, quote unquote, opens up the issue of the replacement in the very top income distribution of Europeans and Westerners like Asians. So there are many topics there which are new, and that actually an appropriate topic of study for the time of globalization. So these are the reasons why there may be others, because we have more data, as I mentioned before. But these are the key reasons why I'm very optimistic about the future in terms of studies.
That's great. I'm very excited to hear how enthusiastic you are about the future of the field. And this was probably the right time then to come with this book that talk about the past of the field, right? Let me show it again, Visions of Inequality. Thanks a lot for being here. This was a delightful conversation. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was really very, very pleasant, very nice. And thanks a lot for the questions, which enabled me to sort of go through the entire book, author by author. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.